Uh, okay, so we'll make a start. Hello and welcome to this talk entitled The Duties of a Healthcare Professional in the Climate Emergency. How should doctors, nurses and allied healthcare professionals respond? I hope you find the presentation interesting and thank you very much for coming along to this evening's talk. My name is Dr. Katharine Fallon and I've been a GP for over 30 years, most recently in Winsford in Cheshire in the northwest. I have recently retired from practice last June, and my retirement plans include cycling around Cheshire and beyond on my electric bike and spending more time on climate activism. I'm happy to talk for ages about my electric bike if anyone has any questions at the end. I've also just become a Royal College of General Practitioners Net Zero Advisor. And again, I'm happy to take any questions about that role later on. It's a new initiative to help in primary care. So I've been interested in environmental matters all my adult life, having been a member of Friends of the Earth and not having bought a plastic carrier bag since about 1989. I was worried when I started reading in the 1980s about the greenhouse effect, but I assumed that because scientists have been writing about this for a long time now, that our governments would have people working on this and taking care of our environment and ecology. Unfortunately, the government's own Committee on Climate Change has reported on several occasions now just how far away from their own inadequate ideals that they actually are. Today, you're going to hear, first of all, from Lucy Hogarth, who is a final year PhD student in the astrophysics group at University College London. She studies how the gas that acts as fuel for stars moves in nearby galaxies. Lucy's going to talk about the science of climate change, and then I'm going to talk about the duties of a healthcare professional. So I'm just going to hand over now to Lucy to introduce yourself, please, and start the first section of the talk. Lucy.
Hi, everyone. As Cassie said, I'm here to talk about some of the latest science about the climate emergency and give some insight into what it's doing in our world today. So, as Cassie said as well, I'm an astrophysics PhD student, and I've been involved in climate activism for about 4 years, really since the start of my PhD when I came back to London and XR had really started to become very visible. It was amazing to me as a scientist that despite having spent at that point 6 years studying science, that the climate emergency was something that was just never discussed. And when I came back to London and saw these protests that were so vivid and really gave you a sense of urgency, it really motivated me to actually look more into the climate crisis. Is what these people are saying true? And what I found out was, yeah, pretty much this is what's going on. And for some reason, the scientific community, we're not talking about it. So, yeah, that's why I'm here today to act as science backup to Kathy, and hopefully inspire some of you to get more involved. So moving back to the science, we've already reached 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels of warming, and this already has caused extreme weather phenomenon on our planet. In fact, in 2021, 10 countries set their all-time temperature records. We actually recorded the hottest day in history on planet Earth of 50 degrees Celsius. And that wasn't in Mexico or in the Sahara Desert, it was in Canada. Increasing temperatures on our planet, they have a host of secondary effects. One that we've seen a lot of evidence of in the last few years is the increasing rate and intensity of rainfall. So this happens as hot air has the capacity to hold more water vapor. Water is more likely to evaporate and less likely to condense, essentially. In October 2021, in Italy, there was 74 centimeters of rain in just 12 hours. Weather events that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago are now occurring with increasing frequency. And these are very damaging and also very costly. Again, in 2021, there were 20 separate climate-related disasters in the USA, and each cost at least $1 billion. And that's just in one country. And of course, we have the data for the economic damage in rich countries, but what we don't see is the suffering and death happening in low-income countries that have contributed least to the problem and are least able to cope with it. All of this is happening at 1.2 degrees of warming, yet most climate scientists believe it will hit at least 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century. You may have heard about the safe 1.5 degree threshold of global warming, which was put forward by the Paris Agreement in 2015 as a limit we should aim for. Actually, there's nothing intrinsically special about 1.5 degrees of warming. Modelling the climate is all about probabilities, as with any model where we have incomplete information. So it's very like, well, predicting the weather on the weather forecast. You can give a percentage certainty of a weather event occurring and where it will occur. But once we add in global heating, the compounding uncertainty of tipping points that will be crossed and feedback loops that will be triggered means that our uncertainty is so insanely wild after we keep heating our planet that that uncertainty compounds with every incremental increase in global mean temperature. So 1.5 degrees is around about where climate modelers can no longer say with confidence what will happen to our planet. But the range of scenarios are terrifying. What I'm explaining is depicted very well in the figure on the right, where the red line corresponds to the temperature change in a very high carbon dioxide emission scenario. The pale red area shows the range of possible outcomes, with the red line in the middle itself being the mean outcome. The uncertainty range is by far reduced in the blue lower emission scenario. However, even with an emission scenario aiming for 1.5 degrees of warming, we only have a 2 in 3 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees of global warming. One thing that we do know for certain, though, is that we are entering a no analog state. Human beings, we haven't existed in these sorts of conditions before. If you could go to the next slide, Kathy, thank you. So when we're talking about an increase in mean temperatures, the sorts of temperatures that we're talking about here don't seem that big. I mean, we're talking about 1.2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 3 degrees. It's difficult for us from our perspective to understand what that actually means. I think intuitively we think that instead of being 20 degrees, it will be 21 degrees or 22 degrees. But what these temperature changes actually are, though, are global mean temperatures. The distribution of temperatures on our planet looks something a bit like a bell curve, like on the slide here. So it has a mean, which is the most probable temperature, and it has tails that extend into the extreme colder and hotter temperatures, which are the least likely extreme temperatures. So at any one time, a place is most likely to be the mean, but could be any temperature under the curve. When the global mean temperature is increased, what it does is it shifts the bell curve to the right, towards hotter temperatures, like in this figure, where you can see the original bell curve is centered on that average mark in the figure, and then it's shifted towards the hotter end. That also means that hot temperatures that were very improbable in the old distribution become much more likely. And it also means that record-breaking hot temperatures with close to zero probability in the old distribution become a lot more probable. So a change in global mean temperatures isn't about increasing by 1.5, 2 or 3 degrees. It's about making those hot extreme temperatures a lot more likely. And then those very hot temperatures will then power other extreme weather events like the intense rainfall that we discussed earlier. But the climate crisis isn't just about the weather. It changes everything. It affects every sector and has been described as the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century, the biggest threat wildlife will face this century, the biggest global health threat of the 21st century, the greatest security threat of the 21st century, the single greatest threat to sustainable development, and the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. The climate crisis is described by social psychologists as a wicked problem, which is a term that I think is perfect to describe it. And essentially, a wicked problem is a problem that it's actually really hard to formulate what kind of problem it actually is. Wicked problems are multifaceted in every respect. They're incomplete, sometimes completely contradictory, and constantly changing. As a result, there is no point at which someone has enough information to make decisions. Wicked problems demand a continuous process of evaluation and redefinition. And humans are really bad at handling those sorts of problems. We like to have a single plan from one single problem definition and then just stick to that plan. How we define the climate crisis depends on our own unique perspective and framing of the problem. So, for instance, if you frame the climate crisis as an environmental problem, which it often is framed as, you're unlikely to appreciate the whole problem. So defining it as one thing automatically reduces your ability to understand its full scope and magnitude, maybe limiting your ability to understand it as a political issue or an economic issue or a health issue. And of course, environmental issues are historically connected to left-leaning political groups, which other rival social groups will intrinsically ignore. So this definition also alienates a significant number of people from the problem entirely. One thing that we know for sure is that climate change is a major threat to life on Earth. And ecologists are particularly concerned because it will cause the disappearance of many of our richest and most important ecosystems. We've all known and heard about the imminent disappearance of sea ice, but coral reefs, for example, are also particularly vulnerable to rising ocean temperatures and are on track to largely disappear within the next few decades. This is particularly worrying as reef fish provide a major source of dietary protein for hundreds of millions of people in tropical countries. In recent years, we've also seen how vulnerable forests are to drying and fires. And it's now thought that many of our tropical forests, like the Amazon, could be transformed into savannas if heating continues unchecked. The climate crisis will also influence the habitability of the planet for human beings. Like other species, humans have a particular ecological niche, and we simply cannot survive in a place that has a mean annual temperature above 29 degrees Celsius. Currently, those places occupy about 0.8% of the land on Earth, which is shown in black here on the figure, which is limited to the Sahara Desert at the moment. But under a very high emission scenario, in just 50 years, these will have expanded to cover places that are currently home to 3 billion people. This map only focuses on temperature. There will also be a sea level rise that will inundate many of the world's greatest cities and force their relocation. So in other words, we're talking about a complete rearrangement of where people live on the planet. And this will involve abandoning countless trillions of pounds worth of infrastructure, enormous conflict, and unimaginable suffering. Given the political instability that we already experience due to immigration, it's really genuinely hard and painful to imagine the social instability that that sort of mass migration will cause. And we're already starting to see signs that part of our world are becoming uninhabitable. In April of last year, a dangerous early summer heat wave swept across India and Pakistan, which led to power and water shortages across the countries. The Horn of Africa experienced its worst drought in over 40 years, which led to a food security crisis. In addition to that, Spain and southern France also suffered a severe drought with temperatures roughly 3 degrees higher than average in May and June of last year, with rainfall roughly 13% of the normal level. And of course, we experienced the recent record-breaking UK heat wave last summer, where we experienced over 40 degrees of heat. Much of the UK had just 10% of its normal rainfall over last summer compared to average levels. China also suffered its worst drought on record last August. The low river levels have reduced the ability of hydroelectric power stations to generate energy. Emergency measures imposed to save electricity include factories closing, shops reducing opening hours, and office buildings switching off air conditioning, all in response to that double whammy of high demand for electricity and low production. Also last year, monsoon rains also caused devastating floods in Pakistan, leaving millions homeless, destroying buildings, bridges and roads, and leaving vast swathes of the country underwater. Flash floods and landslides across the Indus and Kabul rivers left more than 1,000 dead and 1,600 injured. The climate change minister stated that more than a third of the country was completely submerged by the heaviest recorded monsoon rains for decades. The UN estimated that around 33 million Pakistanis, which is 1 in every 7 people, were affected by the flooding, with more than 500,000 homes destroyed or damaged. Raging floodwaters also swept away 700,000 head of livestock and damaged more than 3.6 million acres of crops, completely wiping out cotton, wheat, vegetable, and fruit harvests. Professor Will Stephan, an American chemist who was the executive director of the Australian National University Climate Change Institute and also co-founder of the Climate Council, suggests that the likely outcome of these changes isn't just the loss of ecosystems and mass migration, but the collapse of civilization itself. In reference to our growth-focused economic systems, he says, "It is becoming abundantly clear that this system is incompatible with a well-functioning Earth system at the planetary level. This system is eroding human and societal well-being, even in the wealthiest countries. And collapse is the most likely outcome of the present trajectory of the current system." It's worth reading that last part again. He isn't just saying that collapse is a possible outcome, but the most likely outcome of our current trajectory. All we have to do to reach that point is carry on as we are now on our current trajectory. The threat of societal collapse is now so real that it has spawned a new academic discipline entirely called collapsology. The most likely trigger for this agricultural failure, the most likely cause of this is agricultural failure. All civilizations have evolved during a period called the Holocene, which has been a period of remarkable climate stability over the last 10,000 to 12,000 years. We have now left the Holocene. Simultaneous agriculture failure in several of the world's major food-producing regions will lead to global food shortages and civil unrest. And this is the most likely trigger for collapse. And collapse could well happen before we reach 3 degrees of warming. In other words, it could happen within our lifetimes. So the thing I'm trying to really impress on you is that this is an emergency. In an emergency, we stop what we're doing and we focus all of our efforts on the urgent task at hand. But while our governments acknowledge that it's an emergency, they're not acting like it. Do you go to the next slide? Sorry, Kathy. The executive director of the International Energy Agency said last year that if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal from now, from this year. And they said that in 2021. This isn't an activist saying this. This isn't Extinction Rebellion. This is the executive director of the International Energy Agency. So governments have been told that. How have they reacted? So here are some of the headlines, all since COP26 in 2021. Immediately after COP26, the Biden administration held the largest oil and gas sale in US history. More recently, in last February, the UK announced plans to approve 6 new oil fields in the North Sea. The UK, we continue to call ourselves a world leader in climate action, but such actions not only help to perpetuate the fossil fuel age, but they also send a very strong message to the rest of the world that we're not serious about our own pledges and commitments. So why should any other country care? This report published a couple of years ago called the Production Gap report shows that countries intend to produce twice as much fossil fuels as would be compatible with meeting their agreed targets. So the red line in this graph represents the carbon dioxide that countries plan to emit in their projections. And the brown line, which is just below the red, represents the commitments that individual countries have made. However, the blue and green lines are the emissions consistent with a 1.5 and 2 degrees temperature rise, respectively. So essentially, the production gap is the difference between what countries plan to emit and what is actually consistent with the climate pledges made, such as the Paris Agreement. And you can see it's quite a substantial gap. When we take a closer look at international climate negotiations, we see that they've had essentially zero impact on emissions. Actually, if you correlate temperature rise with the number of climate conferences we have, you get a kind of positive correlation. This is no surprise when we actually look at the COP process. At COP26, for example, which was held in 2021 in Glasgow, the fossil fuel industry had a larger delegation than any country. The people trying to prevent action had the biggest seat at the table. As a result, the texts that come out of these COP meetings don't specify the one thing that actually needs to be done, which is to stop producing and burning fossil fuels. 82% of our emissions come from fossil fuels, yet at COP26, it was actually the first time that fossil fuels were ever mentioned in the agreed statement. This is the equivalent of spending 25 years discussing a global COVID strategy without ever mentioning viruses. It's completely nonsensical, and it's because of state capture by fossil fuel industries. As Professor Schullenhuber, and I apologize if I said his name wrong, physicist and founder of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, says, political realities must be grounded in physical reality. In other words, you can't negotiate with physics. And as a physicist myself, that's something I understand very well, and it speaks to me a lot. And yet, according to British climate scientist Professor Kevin Anderson, the politicians and negotiators are simply not living in the same world as scientists and those who understand the reality of their findings. And I think that Greta probably puts all this the best and a lot better than I could. I think that's back to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Lucy. So this is an emergency. And as Lucy said, in an emergency, we take emergency action. We stop what we're doing and we focus on what needs to be done. How do we help to prevent this headlong rush into the destruction of everything? The NHS England has actually come up with targets for us. The NHS will be carbon neutral by 2040, with an 80% reduction in emissions by 2032. That's just in 9 years' time. And supply chains should be included so that by 2045, we're completely carbon zero. So that's our target. Statements from the General Medical Council's good medical practice are clearly aligned with the need to take action in relation to the climate emergency. Good clinical practice says we should hold human life with the utmost respect, we should practice from a scientific evidence base, and we should act promptly when patient safety may be compromised. It is, in fact, a medical emergency. The climate crisis is a health crisis. Following 2 weeks of occupation in central London for the first XR rebellion in April 2019, a group came together to form Doctors for Extinction Rebellion. It was important to bring health into discussions around the climate crisis and also to use our influence and privilege as health professionals to help with the image of such movements. With doctors and nurses on side, no longer could these movements be dismissed as a bunch of unemployed hippies, which is how the media likes to portray XR participants. Some health facts. The 2020 heat waves in the UK were estimated to have led to more than 2,500 deaths. That's from the Climate Coalition Health Report 2021. There are more strokes, heart attacks, heart failure, etc. The 40-degree Category 1 heat wave last year, the first time ever that this temperature has been reached in the UK, resulted in over 1,000 excess deaths above what would normally be expected, according to Antonio Gasparini from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as reported in New Scientist. Climate change is responsible for increased incidence of dementia and mental health problems such as anxiety and depression about the future. Food security will be negatively impacted by climate change with lower yields, increased costs and increased inequity. That's from the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, Special Report 5 on food security. Air pollution, mainly from the burning of fossil fuels, contributes to 40,000 premature deaths in the UK alone, and I think 7 million worldwide. And that's from the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Paediatric Health in a report called Every Breath We Take, 2016. In a business as usual scenario, over the next 50 years, 1/3 of the global population is projected to experience an uninhabitable climate. And that's from the Future of the Human Climate niche. And you saw that on the two maps of the world that Lucy talked about earlier. So that's 1/3 of humans with nowhere to live. 1/3 who will either have to migrate or die. So we're moving back to Lucy for the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Kathy. So I'm going to change direction a little bit and talk about two theories of change about how science influences society. But we need to examine them more closely because they're actually based on faulty assumptions. We've known about climate change and the destruction of the planet for decades, but that knowledge hasn't helped to stop it. The first theory of change is that if we generate information, our leaders will use that information to make wise decisions for the benefit of wider society. But in reality, governments don't listen to scientists. They listen to corporate lobbyists and, to a lesser extent, public pressure. For example, in 2020, the oil and gas industry spent almost $250 million influencing politicians in the USA. That's just one country in 1 year. They don't give politicians so much money out of the kindness of their hearts. They do it to influence their decisions, and that process is known as state capture. Our second theory of change is that if scientists warn the public of the consequences of inaction, the public will force our leaders to take the required action. But this doesn't work for two reasons. Firstly, the public is largely misinformed. Fossil fuel industries and free market fundamentalists have invested heavily in a misinformation campaign over the last several decades to convince the public that we don't need to act. For a long time, they've tried to create doubt about the science, but even when they have now given up on their denialism and are now focusing on predatory delay, which means trying to persuade the public that urgent action will be too expensive. Essentially, they're trying to persuade the public that urgent action will be too expensive or isn't required at all. So if you or anyone that you know has had any doubts about the need for urgent action, that's because they're victims of a long-term coordinated campaign of lies and deception. But on top of this misinformation campaign, the public is also largely uninformed. They simply do not know how serious this emergency is because the media isn't covering it as an emergency. The evidence is unequivocal. International medical journals and the United Nations have made plain the crisis that we face. The head of the UN said in April of 2021, sorry, is it April? Yes. Climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the government that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. Yet that is exactly what our government has pledged to do, with six new oil and gas fields in the North Sea and a new coal mine in Cumbria. That's back to you, Kathy.
So what's the alternative? Surely we're not just going to sit here and watch while everything gets destroyed. History shows that the most powerful force for catalysing rapid change is non-violent civil disobedience or civil resistance. Throughout the 20th century, the greatest, most progressive changes were brought about in this way. The suffragettes won the rights for women to vote. Mahatma Gandhi led India to independence from the horrors of empire. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King won civil rights for people of colour. And in the 80s, the gay rights movement won civil rights for LGBTQ people. Civil disobedience is powerful and it works for a number of reasons. It generates media attention. It puts the spotlight on issues so everyone can see the wrong. It involves sacrifice, which causes public concern and can generate sympathy. And this gets people thinking. Non-violence is important, otherwise there would not be any sympathy. XR protesters include 90-year-olds, doctors, vicars, lawyers, and teachers. Although healthcare professionals may be wary of the consequences of non-violent direct action to themselves or others, this must be weighed up with the risks of failing to act on climate change. There is work going on to persuade the General Medical Council, the General Nursing and Midwifery Council, and other professional bodies to change their regulations so that healthcare professionals will not be penalised for participating in civil resistance. It's difficult to attribute causality, but the evidence seems to suggest that civil disobedience has been very powerful so far, but it's not been enough. We've changed the conversation, but so far all we have is words. So we need more. The XR demands are on the screen here. XR is an organisation aiming to prompt our government into the necessary action to reduce the harm from climate change. The first demand is that the government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. Well, the first rebellion in April 2019 achieved the first part of this demand quite quickly. But since then, they've done nothing to address it. The second demand is to act now. The government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. That's the ambitious XR demand. Obviously, the government has said net zero by 2050, but by saying net zero by 2050, it seems that they've forgotten that they actually need to start doing anything about it now. And somehow or other, we're going to get to 2049 and then flick a switch and turn off carbon emissions, but that's just not going to work. The third demand is beyond politics. And this means that governments must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. Citizens' assemblies have recently been convened in Ireland to advise and inform policymaking on issues such as abortion, gay marriage, and city mayors. Groups made up of a cross-section of citizens have met, been briefed by speakers, debated the issues, and come up with recommendations. The way XR aims to achieve these demands draws upon the history of protest movements and what works: civil resistance and non-violent direct action. Our political system is no longer fit for purpose. Politics needs an upgrade. We need an alternative as proposed by XR through citizens' assemblies. So I'm going to pause now and show you a couple of videos. So Doctors for XR carried out their first major non-violent direct action during the rebellion of 2019, April. And here's a short video about it.
I took an oath that the duty to my patients would come first. With the climate crisis, protection and safety of my patients is not coming first. And therefore, it's up to us as doctors to lay down a marker and say enough is enough.
When you've read the science, you get nightmares. Floods, wildfires, rising sea levels, extinction of all those animals that we rely on. In the global south, people are already living with the effects of extreme weather and climate change. I've seen it. I'm an A&E doctor. I've looked after people in some of those settings.
I'm a practicing GP. I've not been involved in activism before, done all the usual writing letters, signing petitions and so on, but things still go on getting worse and worse. Having been a pretty lifelong conformist who doesn't really like upsetting people, this is well out of my comfort zone, but it's just something that's got to be done. There does seem to be something that will make a difference, and there is a chance of turning this thing around.
I'm a mother of 3. I've come here today to do something about the climate crisis with other doctors and make our voices heard.
I've got 3 kids, and they're really the reason why I'm here, because when I think about their future, I feel genuinely scared. I have a duty to them, really, to act, so that when they turn around to me in 10 years and say, well, Dad, what did you do when you found out about this stuff, that I can say, well, actually, I tried. I didn't just keep going to work and just plodding on.
I'm feeling really nervous, but it feels much better to be doing something about it than feeling totally powerless to make any difference at all.
My baby will be 31 in 2050, and I have no idea what her future holds. When your government refuses to look after you and your children, you have to act.
I've done everything that's polite, so now it's come to this.
I feel I have no choice but to rebel.
We're doing this because the government isn't taking action on climate change. This is our duty. This is our duty. It's our duty to do whatever we can.
So after that action, the editor of The Lancet, Richard Horton, publicly declared his support for non-violent direct action.
My name is Richard Horton and I'm editor of The Lancet. The climate emergency that we're facing today is the most important existential crisis facing the human species. And since medicine is all about protecting and strengthening the human species, it should be absolutely foundational to the practice of what we do every single day. The GMC publishes an extremely important document which guides all health professionals' duties of a doctor. The duties of a doctor are first and foremost to an individual patient or the public that they serve. The climate crisis is one of the most, I would say, the most existential crisis facing our communities in the world today. Doctors and all health professionals have a responsibility and obligation to engage in all kinds of non-violent social protest to address the climate emergency. That is the duty of a doctor. The GMC, based on its own documentation, should be fully supportive of all health professionals who engage in that kind of non-violent social protest. My thoughts about the doctors who've been arrested during the Extinction Rebellion protests are thoughts of extreme humility. I hope that those who work in the medical profession not just recognize the contribution that they have made personally, but make sure that they are protected from anybody who might seek to damage or harm their future careers in medicine. We're the only species that exists that's created this incredible superstructure of a health system. Fundamentally, Human beings care about each other. We wouldn't have built health systems if we didn't care about each other. We wouldn't have nurses, we wouldn't have doctors or any other health professionals. We wouldn't have created clinics or hospitals unless we fundamentally loved one another. Surely there's not only great hope, but also great encouragement for health professionals and their organizations and other groups in society to work together, to cooperate together to solve these problems that we face collectively. If every single person who's a health professional just did one thing every single week, we'd be having millions of people committing themselves, acting in a way that when you multiply that up over time, could be absolutely transformational for the politics of our country. That should be inspiring hope amongst all of us that we really can achieve social change. And if you look at the history of social activism and the history of social change, that is what has done it. The brave acts, sometimes the small brave acts of a large number of people have made the difference. And that's our task, our responsibility today in the 21st century.
Okay. COVID delayed further actions until 2021 when Doctors for XR targeted JP Morgan Chase. This is the bank of the world with the highest investment in fossil fuels. This is the former medical director of Lewisham Hospital and a consultant surgeon. Both had to protest outside JPM. I think it was in September 2021 that Doctors for XR also carried out a corpse action in Westminster opposite the Houses of Parliament, in which I think over 100 people lay down on the ground as corpses and were covered in white sheets with death certificates indicating what their cause of death was, something related to the climate crisis, which was a very powerful action. And that was when I first became involved with Doctors for XR. In April 22, Doctors for XR held a series of non-violent direct actions as part of the wider movement. The group blocked the entrance to the Treasury and delivered a letter asking them to stop subsidising fossil fuels. In addition, Lambeth Bridge was blocked and 6 people stayed long enough to be arrested. These 6 people were all acquitted last November at a magistrates' court hearing. Fiona Godley, the former BMJ editor, publicly showed her support by joining Doctors for XR on the bridge. We also joined XR scientists to target Shell and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. You can see in these 2 photos that scientists have stuck scientific papers onto the windows of the buildings explaining different aspects of the climate crisis and the nature crisis. I think there were a number of arrests at the BEIS and there was 1 arrest at the Shell building. And you will all have heard about the recent extremely high and obscene profits that the fossil fuel companies Shell, BP and ExxonMobil have been making. Top right, you can see the action outside the Treasury where some doctors and nurses are locked onto canisters representing gas and oil. And a theatre piece was carried out where a resuscitation of the dying Earth was carried out, which proved to be unsuccessful. We carried the Earth on that stretcher around Westminster, visiting 8 other ministries, including the Foreign Office, Home Office, Department for Business, Education, Transport, and so on, carrying out the theatre action at various stages. I should mention a recent article in Open Democracy, which reveals that the government has given away carbon dioxide permits in a £1 billion handout as profits by the petrochemical industry soar. So that's Shell, BP and ExxonMobil getting a £1 billion handout. This is a double-page photo in a copy of the BMJ last June, I think. Doctors at an action outside Downing Street. Again, the group was asking for the government to stop financing new fossil fuels. And we're nearly at the end of the talk, and I'm just going to show another clip.
It's an incredibly moving experience to see people giving up their weekends, risking arrest in civil disobedience, and trying to give a really powerful message to Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak and his cabinet that they're going in the wrong direction. We really want to give a very strong message to Boris Johnson to stop new fossil fuel. We don't need it. We need a completely different direction of travel. Otherwise, we are really facing extremely catastrophic consequences for human health and survival. We had such a big fanfare around COP, and Britain was the host, and all the fine words were said. And then, really, before the ink on the pages dried, here we are with these new investments. And the really big sort of scary thing is that they're not necessary. It's not going to cut fuel costs. It's not going to help the people who need help in terms of the cost of living crisis. And all it's going to do is reduce our credibility in the international discussions and add to the problem of climate change. So I'm really hoping that the General Medical Council and the General Nursing Council will stand up and recognise that this has become, sadly, part of core activity for doctors and nurses, that they feel that they must, in order to protect the public, protect their patients, speak up about climate change. And if that means they have to protest, if that means they risk arrest, we need their regulatory bodies, GMC, General Nursing Council, to support them in that. It's a terrible situation that should be necessary, but we can't have, really vital doctors and nurses being unable to practice because they are compelled to protest in protection of their patients and the public.
No new fossil fuels! No new fossil fuels! No new fossil fuels! No new fossil fuels! No new fossil fuels!
Doctors for XR have been back to JP Morgan on a number of occasions because, just to mention it again, it's the fossil fuel company that has it's the bank that has financed fossil fuel companies the most in the world, having financed fossil fuels by more than $300 billion since the Paris Agreement. These doctors and nurses broke glass at JP Morgan, and it says on the posters, in case of medical climate emergency, break glass. You may have heard about a group of XR protesters from other groups called the Barclays 7, who did the same thing at Barclays earlier on last year. And they were tried by a jury and found guilty of causing criminal damage, but they were recently sentenced and they were all given non-conditional suspended sentences, which is probably the best outcome that could have occurred at this stage. Back to JP Morgan. This is Lord's cricket ground. JP Morgan like to indulge in a bit of sports washing when they can. Sports washing is like greenwashing, but when applied to sports. So two members of Doctors for XR dropped this banner and to applause, I understand, from the crowd before being escorted out. JP Morgan also sponsored the recent Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. And you might have also heard that Shell are sponsoring British cycling. These are all examples of sports wash. You might like to support these actions, but for whatever reason, you're not in a position to get arrested, and we understand that. We encourage professionals in the global north to take part and possibly risk arrest because others around the world are less able to do so, and someone needs to act as a voice for the voiceless. There are many ways to contribute without risking arrest, so please do not let that put you off. There are many support roles required: photography, looking after welfare, observation, outreach, talking to people, admin, social media, and so on. There is a campaign coming up in April that I just want to mention, from April the 21st, called The Big One. And this is a big action which has been developed by XR, but it's not going to be run under a banner of XR because it's going to be an alliance with many other groups, such as other medical activism groups, student groups, hospitals, perhaps royal colleges, we hope, families, maybe churches. I'm just going to read out a bit from a letter that we're developing currently to be sent to organisations to try and encourage them to join in with this rebellion, which is starting on Friday the 21st of April. We hope for at least 4 or 5 days, possibly longer. Extinction Rebellion has initiated an exciting new project called 100 Days, which was launched in January, and which we expect to be co-owned by other aligned organisations. As part of this project, it has committed to avoiding actions that disrupt the public over the 100-day lead up to a planned climate coalition protest outside Parliament starting on April 21st. The plan is for this protest to continue for at least 4 days, and we are hoping to support a significant health contingent throughout this period. Health for XR, I should mention actually that Doctors for XR is currently being rebranded as Health for XR to be as inclusive as possible. Health for XR are supporting this non-violent, minimally disruptive demonstration and would like to co-form a health bloc with aligned climate and justice movements and health workers of all affiliations and none. Our plan is to create a climate and health hub in Abingdon Gardens, which is opposite the Houses of Parliament. We would love you to support and be part of the creation of this hub, which we envision will hold talks and activities throughout the 4-day period. Extinction Rebellion is hoping that 100,000 people will join the demonstration to form one of the largest pro-environmental collective actions in history. We believe that health workers should be a core part of this movement, and we're aiming to have more than 500 health workers participate. Our ask will be, for health's sake, stop financing new fossil fuels. And our planned messaging will focus on the health risks of the climate and ecological emergency, the health benefits of climate mitigation, and the urgent need for a justice-based solution to the climate crisis. This ask is consistent with those of Extinction Rebellion, which are as follows: an immediate end to new fossil fuel investment and to use the Citizens' Assembly to decide the route we will take to stop using fossil fuels that is just for everyone and for all life on our planet. The protest will be trans-organisational. The campaign materials and website will not be XR branded, and we are working with a variety of stakeholders and organisations to mobilise different audiences. We're focusing on creating a massive demonstration and are planning for this to be inclusive, empowering and fun. There will be music, speeches and activities to be arranged, but we are not planning lock-ons, gluing on or other activities that might aggravate arrest. So we do hope that you might consider looking at our website, doctorsforxr.com, joining us if you're not already a member, and also blocking out time in your diary and reserving annual leave so that you can attend these extremely important actions in London from the 21st of April. Join us if we're to have any chance of bringing about the changes that we desperately need to preserve what we can for the future and keep temperature rise to a minimum. We have the knowledge to build a better, more just and livable future where nature can start to regenerate. We're open to all healthcare professionals and many roles are available. So finally, I'd just like to ask that you consider your professional duties and reflect on what you could do to help with the emergency we face. Please have a look at our website. There are also other organisations that you could join, like MedAct or Greener Practice, or looking at the website for the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. There's the UK Alliance on Climate and Health Action. There are all kinds of medical groups that are involved in this battle to try and get climate action taken. So find your niche and then start doing things and talking to people and encouraging others to do the same. So we've got another 2 talks coming up over the next few weeks, and we'll put, I'll see if I can get a link for those in the chat as well. These are also advertised on the Centre for Sustainable Health Care website and also on our website. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll now open up for any questions. And I'm going to stop the recording.